We often get questions about legal issues around podcasting, around intellectual property. I've got an opinion, but I also know the person that I go to. Today, I am thrilled to introduce you to Gordon Firemark. He's known as the podcast lawyer. He also does entertainment law, literary law. He is forgotten more than most people know. And while everybody at the podcast conferences has an opinion on these things, most of them haven't even stayed in a Holiday Inn Express the night before. The smart ones go to the breakouts. They go to the keynotes that Gordon is doing, because he not only tells us how to protect ourselves, but he tells us how to stay out of trouble. Great friend, great lawyer from Southern California. Gordon, welcome.
Thank you so much, Tom, for having me. It's great to be here.
I always go to your breakout sessions and it's like, oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know this. And it's usually horror stories. It's like, oh, I never thought about that. And that's what I love, is that you help podcasters, you help the guests. And one of the common questions that we get is around this whole idea of a release form. Sometimes people are shocked the first time they see it. Can you explain the whole idea behind that and why it's really best practice to have one?
Well, the release is really an agreement between the podcaster, the host of the show, and the guest that gives the podcaster the consent from the guest to record the show and to publish it in the form of the podcast or whatever. Now, many of these releases do go a little further and say things like, well, we can use it in any media now known or hereafter devised, and those kinds of things. And that's really just to protect the podcaster's right to maybe change, to, as we've seen recently in podcasting, to go from audio to video and doing YouTube, or maybe to transcribe the interviews and turn them into a book or something like that. And usually it's, there's no compensation in most instances. And it's really that consent, and also just really very clearly stating that the episode we create together belongs to the host. And that's that work made for hire clause that people often see and get a little agitated about.
Right. And I feel bad now because full transparency here, we don't have a guest release form on there on this episode. But I would say, well, don't we sort of have that understanding in that I reached out to you, invited you to be on the podcast, you accepted, we're recording it, I'm recording it. Why do you need a piece of paper to sign?
Well, Tom, there is implied consent in the fact that I joined the call and the fact that I turned on my camera so we could record. But the real question is, what's the scope of that consent? What are you allowed to do with this recording? Are you even allowed to publish it? I mean, presumably that's sort of implied, but do you want to have to, getting into court and wrestling with proving that, oh yeah, well, he knew we were going to do this, or he knew we were going to do that. So much better to have a written release, or I'm going to give you an oral release right now that says all the things you needed to say. So I hereby grant you the permission and consent to record and publish my voice in the recording we make today, and you as the creator of that recording will own it. My contribution to the episode will be treated as a work made for hire that belongs to you. I understand that I'm not being compensated except with the exposure and that, and you can use it in any medium now known, hereafter devised, for any purposes whatsoever. Just try not to tarnish my reputation.
Well, my reputation...
It's on me if it's tarnished. My reputation, it's what I say.
My reputation goes up being seen with you. But another thing is, like, when you sign it, people are worried, am I giving away my intellectual property that they can use?
Yeah, that's probably the most common concern I hear from people is, well, they didn't want to give away their intellectual property. And the truth is, you're not. Unless it's an extraordinarily worded release, what it's doing is saying the intellectual property we create together, you're giving to the host. And that really would be the case anyway. It's pretty obvious that the person who starts the recording and runs the equipment is the owner of that copyrighted material. But again, I'd rather have it spelled out in English than have to rely on those assumptions. But you're not giving away the book that you wrote last week or the articles and your know-how and knowledge. You're just giving away ownership of the recording of your performance during the interview. And I think that's a fair trade.
Would you ever advise a guest to have a release form that they send to the host just to make it very, very generic? So even if they don't ask, that you've spelled out the guidelines?
I think it's not a bad idea to have something. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the format of a separate document. It could be in the email exchange and so on, where you say, you lay out the understanding. This is what we're doing. We're going to record this episode for a podcast. It's going to be used in these media and for these purposes. And go with God and have a good time. And if you have restrictions, like you don't want it used in certain ways, then you say so in that same document. And that's the thing. When you are confronted with one of these releases, if there's something about it that makes you uncomfortable, well, first off, talk to the podcaster. Don't just assume, well, I'm not going to sign this. And if there's something that you want to change or add a restriction, have the conversation. And, if you use it for commercial purposes, we will negotiate a reasonable royalty or something like that. That's a reasonable way to go about it.
Yeah, it's I heard a horror story the other day from a podcaster. They had a great podcast, had all of these different people that they interviewed, and they put it together in a book, and they were quoting them, and it got picked up by one of the big publishers. And the publisher said, show me the release form for every one of these quotes. And they didn't have it. And so not only couldn't they use it in the book without going out and get it, but those guests couldn't be included in there because they hadn't signed that.
Yeah. And some podcasts is really just a compilation. The book they write is a compilation of all the interviews that they've done. And you better have that release.
Yeah. I want to be mentioned in the book.
Exactly.
So, we talk about the law around this, and you're the podcast lawyer, but really it's more than that, right? It's intellectual property, it's entertainment. So one of the issues that comes up is the whole idea of around copywriting, and what does that mean to podcasts?
Well, I've been practicing entertainment law for 30-something years now, and podcast law and copyright law, they go together. It's part of entertainment law. Copyright law is the body of law that protects the original works of authorship that creators create. And it's automatic. So when you are the author of something and you fix that expression of your ideas in some tangible form, like a recording or on paper or sculpted into stone or whatever, you instantly own a copyright in the work. And that ownership of the copyright gives you exclusive rights to make copies, distribute them, perform or display the work in public, and also to make derivative works. That is, the things that incorporate and use the original. And so as the exclusive rights holder, you get to say yes or no and maybe charge money to give permission to others to do those kinds of things. And that is the whole purpose of a copyright law. It's actually in the U.S. Constitution, saying Congress shall have the power to make some laws that will give authors and inventors these exclusive rights for limited times. It's designed to incentivize the creation by, giving us a profit motivation for making things. But then at some point, it's a limited time. After a while, it expires, and that becomes the stuff that we can build on as a society.
Well, and because if everybody could steal it, why would you make it in the first place?
Exactly.
So how does that apply to podcasts? So we record this interview. Who owns the copyright on this recording? Is it you, me, both of us?
Well, without the release, that's one of the possible implications, is that we got together to create something jointly. And in the absence of evidence otherwise, that might be interpreted as the intent of the parties. That would make it a jointly owned copyright that we share ownership of. That is not usually what podcast creators are after. They want to make sure they own and control the stuff they make themselves, and the interviews they conduct and so on. Just like when you go on the news on a radio show or a television show, it's their equipment, it's their facilities, it's their, the whole thing happens because of their impetus. So they want to own the copyright in that material. And so, when podcasters do a recording, usually we say he who pushes the record button is the owner of the copyright.
So what access does the guest have to that material? Right? Because, everybody wants to repurpose it to get that out there, as seen on television, as seen on the podcast. It's such rich content. So what rights do you have to that?
Technically, you don't have any right to do that unless you've got it specified in a written contract. Again, if the podcaster owns the copyright, that means the exclusive rights belong to them. So unless they have given back to the guest some promise of you can use it in these ways, you don't have those rights. And unfortunately, a lot of guests assume that they're going to repurpose the content, and then it becomes a thing with the podcaster. So that's the kind of thing you want to have in that conversation early on, and maybe build it into that release agreement you're pulling out of your own pocket, and if they don't have one for you. I think that's a really good idea.
It's interesting. I remember one of the events we were at, it was probably like 2017. I asked this question to Pat Flynn, who at the time was the podcast host of the year. And I loved his answer. He says, I don't care where people hear about me as long as they hear about me. And he's like, you can repurpose it, just do it in a professional way and make sure you attribute me on that. And I think that's the heart of it. But it's copyrighted material, so unless you have an understanding, you should ask, right?
Yeah. Well, the truth is most podcasters won't mind if you take a clip from the podcast and put it on your website or whatever. I mean, I think they'd rather that you just link to the website or to the podcast, because after all, if they're advertiser supported, the number of downloads from their site is what's important for how they monetize and so on. But what I don't think, what I know they don't like, because I have the calls from people, is, well, they took the interview and they edited it themselves and they turned it into something else, and they cut the interviewer out altogether. And that's not okay. That is the derivative work creation, right? And I would say, even if they say go ahead and repurpose it, but generally they don't intend that you're going to do that. And so if that's what you want to do, make sure you ask permission and get it very clearly stated that it's okay.
Would it be appropriate even on the conversation like you and I just did here, where you gave me verbal approval to do that? So either before you're doing the interview, after you're doing the interview, just to communicate that with the host. Gordon, thank you so much for having me on your podcast. I would like to repurpose this content to amplify it to your audience. I'll attribute you on anything. Do I have permission to do that? Would that be adequate?
Well, if you are making and keeping a recording of your own of that conversation, then I think you've at least got some, plausible evidence that you've got that permission. But I'd actually rather see it in the email or in a written document. Just so, before the interview starts, I would say I should say when you're booking the interview or whatever, I'm happy to appear on your show as long as I can.
Yeah, and it's that whole idea of no surprises. If we both know what we're doing beforehand and have agreed to it.
In fact, I talk about a podcast prenup between co-hosts and folks but this is sort of that between the host and the guest. It's the what happens if and when, and what are we allowed to do, and whose responsibility is what. Who gets the house and kids?
The podcast prenup avoids the bitter podcast divorce, which gets ugly and expensive, and nobody wins.
The lawyers sometimes win.
Well, you said it, I didn't.
After.
So, one of the things that I hear at the podcast conferences, and we've heard this out in the hallways, is, well, podcasts are different, right? Podcasts are totally different. The government doesn't regulate them. The government doesn't, there's no oversight in this. And I just have to shake my head at times. I'm like, at the times where people think that the government doesn't influence anything, they can influence whatever they want. So
they'll find a way where there's a
yeah. I live in the middle of the country. They can't touch me. They will. Right. So Talk to me about regulation, licensing, all the rest of that. How is it like other areas and unlike others?
Well, it's funny that I always say podcasting is a different industry, different medium, and the rules are a little different. And that is true. That's why you get a release in recording a podcast. But, if you were going on the radio, they probably wouldn't bother. Partly that's the radio is fleeting. It's ephemeral is what we call it. And once it's done, it's done. And part of it is the radio stations have, a cadre of lawyers on retainer ready to fight with you about it. Most podcasters don't have that. It's also true that podcasts aren't regulated in the way that broadcasters are regulated, but that doesn't mean there are no regulations. So broadcasters have to have a license because they're using the public airwaves, a scarce public resource, and that gives the government the authority to regulate the broadcast. The Federal Communications Commission licenses broadcast stations. And so as a condition of that licensing, there are some rules about, the George Carlin's 7 dirty words you can't say on the radio, those kinds of things, as well as some obligations of, being in service to the public and those kinds of things. It's true that the FCC does not regulate podcasting in that same way. You can use the 4-letter words. You can say pretty much anything you want. But there are still some regulatory boundaries. It's not the FCC that we care so much about in podcasting. It's the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, which regulates false advertising and endorsements and things like affiliate advertising. And something that I'm a little concerned about myself is the pay-to-play podcasting. So, and that's where, the guest is paying the host for the opportunity to appear on a show. And that, look, there's nothing inherently wrong with doing that. If you want to get the exposure that way and you're willing to pay for it, great. As a podcaster, I think that the podcaster, by accepting that payment, is essentially, by having you on as a guest, is endorsing you and your point of view, your product, whatever it is. And so because it's an endorsement, they have an obligation to let their audience know that there was a compensation structure behind that. It affects the weight of the evidence, the weight of the perception of that endorsement. And that's what the FTC law requires. It says that influencers and affiliates and so on have to disclose the nature of the financial relationship between the brand they're endorsing and the creator that's putting that out there. It has to be a clear and conspicuous disclosure. And that's the thing that the pay-to-play podcasters aren't doing. And the trouble is that if the FTC does come looking, they may not just be looking at the podcaster. They may also be looking at the brand or the endorsed product or service that you're talking about. So I think it's unlikely, but it's, I guess, possible that you get a call from the FTC. We see that you paid for all these different appearances that you went on. But nobody ever told the audience that they were paid appearances.
Thinking of TV and radio, right? You watch that late night television or early Sunday morning television. Before the program starts out, it says, this is a paid placement, doesn't reflect the views of this station and everything like that. Is that the kind of disclosure that they have to do because it is a paid advertisement?
I think that's sort of the kind of disclosure. I mean, it's a little different when the advertiser has bought the whole half hour of the airtime or something. That's the disclosure you're referring to. But when you're paying to be the guest on a podcast, I guess you have sort of bought the whole half hour. That kind of a disclosure at the beginning, somewhere in the middle and the end, probably makes some sense. The podcaster doesn't necessarily have to be quite that lawyerly about it. I guess they could just say, hey, this episode of the show is sponsored by XYZ Corporation, and today our guest is John Smith. He's the president of XYZ Corporation. Welcome, John. I think that's enough. And it feels organic. It doesn't feel like, well, let me slap you in the face and remind you, hey, I'm getting paid for this.
There's a great podcast out there. I don't know. It's called Don't Say That. I don't know if you've seen that one yet. It's hosted by a gentleman that got a letter from the FTC for some things that he was saying about his product and his service. And it started as a $14 million fine/judgment, and it came back down to, they negotiated it down to, I think it was like 2.5, 3, something like that.
I've seen the ads for his book. I wasn't aware it's a podcast, but I'll have to go check that out.
Yeah, it's a podcast now too, and it's that same thing that that it is regulated. If you say things and the government decides that it violates their regulations, you're responsible.
Yeah, the FTC's rule or goal, I should say, the purpose of the FTC is to protect consumers from false and misleading statements that lead them into making poorly informed purchase decisions and getting bitten, basically. So let's help them out and not hide the ball. Let's be transparent about the fact if you're paying for the endorsement or whatever.
Yeah, and it's I love how somebody said the listener should know if it's an advertisement or an interview. That's fair enough.
Exactly right.
And when people say, well, should I do it? Well, it's like any other paid advertisement, right? If it makes financial sense, why wouldn't you pay to go on there? Just make sure that it's all clear and above board on that.
Just, is there an ROI? And if so, be willing to be transparent and clear about it.
What other things, Gordon, are on your heart with podcasting, and especially from the legal side of it? What's coming down the pike here?
Well, the big thing these days is AI. Everybody's talking about AI, and there's a lot of issues and questions about what's protectable when you use AI tools to make your show. What about the rights of the owners of the material that the AI was trained on? That's another, copyright issue that's where not a day goes by without a new lawsuit being filed, it seems, these days. And then there's the deep fakes. And, I think one thing we should be concerned about, and maybe I'm actually going to have to put it into my release form, is a caveat that you can't use my voice to train an AI or something like that, because we don't most of us don't want clones of ourselves out there without us being in charge of what they say. And that is a big concern. A couple of states have now passed some legislation about it. Particularly in the entertainment industry, the recording industry. Cause I think we've all heard that Johnny Cash singing "I'm a Barbie Girl" song, after his death.
And it was also the new George Carlin, skit that came out, decade after he died, somebody used that.
Yeah. So one of the nice things about new technologies developing is that's always going to make work for lawyers for a while after that happens. And I sound like a money grubber when I say that, and I'm not the kind of lawyer who litigates those cases. But lawyers will always have something to say about new disruptive technologies, and that's what we're dealing with right now.
Have you seen the interview with Reid Hoffman and Reid Hoffman's AI?
No.
I'll send it to you.
I'll check that out.
It is scary. Unless they tell you who is who, I wouldn't have known who was whom in there.
Yeah.
And it was interesting that first Reid interviewed his AI, and then the AI interviewed Reid, and it was spooky how much that was like that. And it's going to be interesting to see. All I know is that my AI will probably be better looking, say and write a whole lot less than I do, and so that's how you'll know it's really me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting from a consumer standpoint about this. I think it really is incumbent upon us to be more skeptical and to ask the questions and really look for, and maybe even call on some regulation to say, hey, if you use AI to create stuff, it needs to be identified. And again, that disclosure, because the consumer should know, is this real or is this Memorex, essentially? And some kind of a logo or a stamp or a bug that goes on screen or something that says, hey, the AI helped me make this, probably is just a nice, it's the Menchie thing to do anyway, the right way to go about it. And I think it wouldn't be surprising if the law started, just like we have to disclose that tobacco products are dangerous for our health, and the food ingredients list on the side of the box of cereal, maybe that's what we'll see is disclosure requirements along those lines.
It's interesting, even the translation. I know there's some influencers out there. I think it was Mr. Beast is translating all of his videos. And now as we go into interview Valet Espanol, we've done that with some of mine, right? And we're intentionally putting on there translated with AI, just a little watermark down there, because it breaks that trust. If all of a sudden we go to a conference and somebody comes up to me and starts speaking Spanish to me, and
Yo no hablo.
all I can say is "Donde está el baño?" It's going to ruin that trust. It doesn't mean we can't serve them, but let's, once again, just like the whole pay to play, let's be honest with everyone.
Well, and this is another thing that we have to be watching for. Spotify recently announced a pilot program with some of their podcasts where they are doing AI translation for other languages, 9 other languages or something. And if they can do it and it works, you can bet they're going to want to do it for every show so that they can get the listeners, as many as they can from wherever in the globe. The thing is that, as the podcaster, do you want some degree of control over that, or do you want to just let Spotify do it and trust that their translation is going to be accurate and not bad for your reputation and those kinds of things? And then you get into questions. I was on a webinar earlier this week with some folks from the Screen Actors Guild, SAG-AFTRA. And when you're using paid talent, they expect to be paid when it's reused in another language and so on. So then we get into all kinds of weird issues there. So it's something we want to keep our eye on. Be careful about the word simulated. If you see in that release, they're saying that they have the right to use your voice real or simulated, or your performance real or simulated, that's a red flag. And I would raise it and try to cross that out of the agreements if you can.
Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again, Gordon, what's ordinary to you is amazing to others and totally amazing to me. Any final thoughts, or how do people get in touch with you?
Well, I'm easy to find. I've got a great last name, Firemark. You can search me out, firemark.com or gordonfiremark.com, and listen to my podcast if you're interested in this kind of stuff. It's Entertainment Law Update. And then there's another one specifically for podcasters called Legit Podcast Pro.
Thank you so much, Gordon, and I look forward to seeing you and hearing from you and learning from you on the stage at all the big conferences.
Sounds great, Tom. Thanks for having me.